So Kevon Looney had a lot to say on the Warriors Plus Minus podcast, and he mentioned how many things throughout the season ultimately drove him away from wanting to remain with the Warriors, but the main thing that he referenced was how he believed Steve Kerr and the coaching staff had lost trust in him when the occasion called for him in the first round against the Houston Rockets. Now, is he wrong that Kerr and the coaching staff lost trust in him? No, he isn't, because Quinton Post did average more minutes in the first round compared to Loon, and it was clear that Kerr didn't feel comfortable playing Loon over Post. Even before the playoffs, Kerr was pretty much getting ready to acclimate Post almost as the starting center. But it begs the question, although the Warriors did get the job done, did Steve Kerr make the right decision to not play Loon more in the first round? Let's look at both sides of the argument. Let's start with the quote-unquote yes side. The main issue with playing Loon more with the starters is the obvious fact that the spacing would get really mucked up. The Warriors actually have a dilemma with Jimmy and Dre at the 4 and the 5, which people aren't talking about enough, and it's the fact that because they're not great jump shooters, it's hard to place them at the 3 or the 4 and pair them up with another center that can't shoot like Loon. That's why whenever Jimmy and Dre play the 3 and the 4, they'll usually play with Post because Post can stretch the floor. So if they run pick and roll with Loon as the screener at the 5, all of a sudden Jimmy and Dre are stuck in the corner and teams are going to help off in the paint. If Jimmy or Dre is now the screener, then Loon is jamming things up in the paint because he's in the dunker spot. And it's easier to guard, they can just switch it. The second thing is transition defense. We already know Loon hasn't even touched 30 years on his birth certificate, but we already know he's like 56 because of his hips. He can't get up and down the floor like that. Houston, whenever they got stops, they were racing it down the floor. They were a very athletic and fast team. If Loon was out there and the spacing was off in the half court and he couldn't run back on defense, then that is a dangerous problem. That's a dynamic that you do not want to deal with. And even defending in the half court, he couldn't move laterally when guarding in the pick and roll. One of the reasons why Jalen Green went off in game 2 was because Loon couldn't guard in space or guard when coming up to the level. He was just getting right around Loon and things were just coming too easy at the rim. Even Fred VanVleet too, he was also getting around him because Loon is not agile. Now here's the thing, Post didn't do better anyways, but so did Loon. So now jumping over to the quote-unquote no side, we'll start with the obvious again, and it's the fact that no one, and I mean no one, was able to hold Steven Adams on the Warriors, not even close. And that's also including Loon. All those tricks where Loon would try to be slick and shove a guy underneath the rim to get a board, that wasn't working on Steven Adams. But with that being said, no one was able to handle that job of boxing out Adams besides Loon. Loon was the guy for us. Adams was so dominant that we had to hack him, and he made his free throws, at least enough. He was one of the reasons why it was so hard for us to quote-unquote get stops, because we would get stops, but then he would just grab all of the rebounds. And the rebounding numbers in every single game for us was huge. They had Jimmy with no booty cheeks trying to wrestle Adams underneath the rim, and he was getting punked. Now, something that the Warriors couldn't figure out how to stop was how Houston was hiding Alperen Sengun. Because if you don't remember, Ime Udoka had Sengun guarding either Pods or Moody, and Fred VanVleet guarding Draymond. That eliminated the two-man game between Steph and Draymond, and they were forced to run pick and roll with Pods or Moody as the screener. But let's say if you have Loon playing the 5, all of a sudden it's going to be much harder to hide Sengun on a wing, because you'll have your backcourt essentially guarding the Warriors' front court. If you keep Fred VanVleet on Draymond, now who's going to guard Loon? Because they have Dylan Brooks on Jimmy Butler. That means they're going to put, Jalen Green on him? Now, I'm not saying this is the answer because Loon is certainly not no post-up powerhouse, but occasionally he can post up a mismatch. Better than Draymond at least. But another thing is that Loon could have dominated on the boards easier since a guard would essentially be boxing him out. We'd be giving Houston a taste of their own medicine. Now let's say Houston is forced to put Sengun back on our 5-man. Now we can run pick and roll with Steph, and if they blitz or hedge, which is what they were doing, Loon is by far our best connector at the 5 spot. Post is good at it, TJD is getting there, but Loon is much more comfortable in the short roll. He has better court mapping skills in my opinion. He can catch in the middle of the floor, scan both sides, and process the defense quickly before eventually making a play. He was fantastic at that in game 7. So overall, looking at both sides, was it the correct decision? I would say no. I would side with Loon here and partially agree that it was wrong to not play him more in a matchup against Houston. In this specific situation, I agree. But I do think that Kerr moving on from Loon and even TJD and entrusting Post with more minutes was indeed not a wrong decision. And I think Loon would agree with himself here because he spoke about the situation like, yeah, we going up against Steven Adams, this is what I do. So he already knows that he's more of a situational type of player to where he'll only play if the matchup calls for him. Because the truth is, he was becoming a specialist. a one-way player, and due to how the roster is constructed, he wasn't in a position to play meaningful minutes without masking his offensive issues. Post was providing more impact with his shooting, feel for the game, and IQ. It's just he wasn't as seasoned and tough as Loon.